again, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Final Fantasy Brave Exvius. My name is Mars, and today we're going to be talking about Akstar, Esther, and Zeno, because I know a lot of people out there may have stumbled upon one or two of their own and are kind of wondering who's the best unit for me to invest my time and resources in. And that's a great question, because a lot of people have said a lot of things about how strong each of them are, which one is best, which one is most powerful, which one has the most damage, which one is most tanky. And today's video is designed to help you figure out which one is most worth your effort, assuming, of course, you have multiple to choose from. Now, that being said, this is, of course, entirely my opinion, so don't get mad at me if I don't rate your favorite character as high. And the other thing to keep in mind is that all three of these units are perfectly capable of handling all of our current content, as well as the grand majority of content to come. So if you don't have the one that makes it to the top of the list today, don't worry about it. If you have any one of these three, you are good to go, and you probably just won't have to pull for a damage dealer in a very, very long time. So with that being said, I did want to start off by comparing some of their similarities. Now, these three units share a lot of things in common. Fundamentally, they are self-imbuing, self-imperiling chainers who use true double hand, with the exception of Zeno, who is true dual wield. And yeah, they're self-sufficient in that regard, and they are the first of many to come units that are able to imbue themselves and unleash devastating damage. And that's ultimately what kind of sets them apart from their cohorts. Units like Hyo, for example, when he came out, he was great, but the problem was you either had to imbue him externally or go non-elemental or equip an elemental weapon, because he had no way to effectively imbue himself. But these three units don't have that problem. They imbue themselves and they imperil for their respective elements. And so in this case, when we're looking at Esther, Akstar, and Zeno, they each have different elements that they prefer. Esther, of course, with thunder, Akstar with fire and ice, and Zeno with fire alone. So in that regard, Akstar is slightly more flexible than the other two because he comes with two different elements that he can choose from. And the nice thing is, most of the time, if an enemy is immune to fire, they're also probably not immune to ice. Since they're kind of a yin-yang or an opposite of one another, it is very common for one of them to be resisted and then one of them to be a weakness. And so this is really handy because Akstar is not going to be resisted by most bosses. Compare that to Esther and Zeno. These two units are essentially, they're most optimally used with their preferred element. So if thunder or fire is immune or resisted, it's going to be harder for them to keep up. But that's a minor detail. Now, as far as imperils go, all three of them do have imperils to complement their preferred elements. Zeno is best off with a 100% imperil on demand, which is really, really nice. Esther has a 75% on demand, as well as a 100% associated with her opening cooldown skill. And then Akstar's only imperil is 75%, which that's still great. That's not bad at all. Now, as far as buffs go, all of them have abilities that buff themselves, their own attack, and all of them have access to 250% buffs. They don't all come into their rotation at the exact same time, but they are all pretty much the same amount. So that one's kind of a wash for me. I'm like, yeah, they've all got it where it counts in that regard. Now, they are pretty similar in terms of their chaining frames as well. Esther, Zeno, and Akstar all share Absolute Mirror of Tranquility, as well as Aerial Ray. All three of them have abilities or attacks that chain within those frames. The unique ones are going to be Akstar and Zeno, who are able to chain with Divine Ruination, and then Zeno and Esther, who are able to chain with Bolting Strike. So each of them kind of have their own little synergies where any of them can chain with one another, but the bottom line is, you always want to be chaining with a duplicate if possible, simply because if they're chaining with each other rather than with a duplicate, they're not going to be doing their maximum amount of damage. So just handy to keep in mind. Zeno wins out by a tiny hair because he's got Bolting Strike in addition to the other ones, but in my opinion, you're probably not really going to use him for that. Now let's dive in a little bit and look at some of Esther's personal pros. Let's get a little bit more detailed. Each of these units have pros and cons, and Esther is one of the ones that I struggle the most with to come up with cons for, because she really is, as many people described her, the damage dealer with no drawbacks. Because she's stupidly tanky, she fills her own LB, which you'll know is a major frustration if you're not able to do counterattacks, or if you're just struggling to generate the crystals that you need for a limit burst. She just fills it herself, and once she's deep into her rotation, it only takes her one turn to completely fill her limit burst. So yeah, really amazing. And you know, that's what the next point talks about, is her short rotation. The other two guys, they have much longer rotations, so for them to hit their maximum burst, it does take them several turns. Esther luckily gets off the ground really quickly. In addition to that, she is pretty simple to build. She is a pretty standard greatsword wielding true double hand damage dealer. So if you've been playing for a while and you pulled on the Cloud or the Elfrida banner, there's a good chance that you've got some of the equipment that you need to make her very powerful. And even if you don't, there are a lot of extremely powerful builds that use 2 of Esther's own TMR that don't require you to have Buster style. So she is super friendly for builds. In addition to that, she does also have 250% double hand, and that means you'll be missing out on the damage variance, but for people who are new or mid-tier to the game and they're still building out their equipment selection, it's a really good way to get some very high attack and damage out of a character without needing true double hand TMRs and stuff. Now, of course, one of the other major pros for Esther is that she has Stone and Machine Killer, which makes her ideal against those targets. If you know, the boss that we're going into is a Stone or a Machine, Esther will beat Zeno and Akstar pretty much every single time. Now, Esther, like, one of the only cons I could really think about with Esther is that she is much weaker if you cannot use her limit burst. So if you're in a mission that says, you know, use no limit burst or whatever, Esther's going to suffer quite a bit from that because her limit burst is the most powerful ability in her rotation. And so if you're stuck using only bolting strike abilities or her AT abilities, you're going to suffer a major damage loss, especially when compared to Zeno and Akstar. So that's where she definitely loses out. And the other thing that I noted is that she is much weaker if not chaining with a dupe. If you're chaining with non-dupes with Zeno and Akstar, like if you chain them with each other, they suffer a little bit less, but in the case of Esther, it is a pretty dramatic drawback in damage because she can't bolting strike with anybody but Zeno or a dupe, and so if she's not with a dupe, you're cutting into your damage quite a lot. The others don't suffer as much when they're doing some non-dupe chaining. So that's Esther in a nutshell. Ultimately, a damage dealer with very few drawbacks whatsoever. Now, Akstar is a little bit more tricky. One of his pros is that he does have the fire and ice options, and like I said, those are great because they tend to be, you know, opposite of each other. So bosses that are immune to fire are usually weak to ice, and it's an awesome option to be able to go between those two. One of the other things that's really awesome about Akstar is that he counters damage with triple cast, and this accelerates the rate of his rotation, and yeah, this is just super handy. And I know a lot of people are like, oh, how much is he going to get hit? Well, you have to understand, in times past, in trials past, it was very easy to make it so that our damage dealers never got hit at all, but with the trials that we've been getting and that we will continue to get, our damage dealers are going to get hit quite a bit, and that's just because of the area of effect, fixed damage that you can't cover, you can't evade, so it means Akstar is going to be getting hit. But the good news about that is that it will frequently activate his triple cast, and that means you don't have to waste other abilities activating it or anything. You can just get that triple cast and get bonus damage if you know, you happen to have died or you have to reset your rotation, because he does have pretty high uptime on his triple cast, but this gives you basically permanent uptime if you're in those tough fights where you're taking fixed damage frequently. Now, one of the other things that's amazing about Akstar is that when he has his TMR equipped, he gets a lot of true double hand, making him pretty easy to gear, and on top of that, his TMR is really nice. I tend to prefer high tide items over auto limit items just because, you know, I tend to be generating counter crystals. I take counter tanks into most of my fights, and so having something that increases the value of each of those crystals is awesome. Now, it's connected with that, Akstar is relatively simple to build. He does come with his own best in slot accessories with his gloves, And you can also get a very high attack katana from Gilgamesh Reborn. So there are a number of great options to gear him out very, very easily. Now, of course, he does have some cons. Not everybody can be Esther in that regard. He's not as tanky, and that is definitely something that for some people will be a little bit difficult to get around. You do have to play a little bit smarter with Akstar, because the second con is that he has a long and complex rotation, meaning that if he dies in the middle of it, it's super disruptive to his damage. You tend to have to know the fight and navigate around this drawback of having a long rotation. And one of the other major drawbacks with Akstar is that we don't have any other two-handed katanas in the game aside from his own STMR. Now, if you add his STMR into the mix, his damage becomes very, very competitive, almost to the point of Esther's, and it's pretty insane. But without it, his damage does suffer a fair amount, and it sucks because we don't have a easy-to-get two-handed katana, because if you compare to Esther, for example, she can use Revolving Saw or the new two-handed greatsword from the banner that's up right now with Diego and Nagi. But Akstar doesn't have any other options for two-handed katanas, and that definitely hurts him if you don't have access to that. But that being said, if you don't have it, he still does plenty of damage. But if you want to talk about, you know, who's easier to gear or who has the best potential with the least amount of effort, Akstar is probably not there. Now, speaking of excellent return with very little effort, let's take a look at Zeno. Zeno is almost on par with Esther in terms of being, you know, a damage dealer who has no drawbacks. He is somewhat tanky. He's not as natively tanky as Esther, but one of Zeno's major perks is that he gets super high amounts of attack with only his helmet equipped, and he's super easy to gear. And you can get tons and tons of attack, and you have free materia slots when you're finished with your builds. And if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, you can always check out my Zeno Complete Guide video where we talk about his builds in depth. But this dude, when he's maxed out on attack, tends to have 1 or 2 leftover materia slots that you can put whatever you want into. So even if you build him out and he's maybe at like 10,000 HP, which is just pretty good, if you wanted to, you could put even more into his equipment. Additionally, if you happen to have an Esther, you can take one of Esther's TMRs and use it as an accessory, and that will give you some tankiness with some flat attack and additional limit burst damage. Now, one of the things about Zeno that makes him stand out is, yes, he prefers fire, however, he is a dual wielder, so you don't have to use a two-handed weapon, and that means you can equip basically any element that you would like to. And since he chains with AT frames, Divine Ruination frames, Bolting Strike frames, and Aureal Ray frames, he can chain with a whole host of different people, and all you have to do is swap out the weapon that he has equipped. Now, he has extremely high true dual wield with just his TMR equipped. It's funny because, you know, when they announced Zeno and that he was going to be a true dual wield damage dealer, I was like, okay, the only way they're going to make this guy appealing is if they put like 200% true dual wield, you know, somewhere in his passives. And that's exactly what they did. So, you know, that was definitely an appealing idea, because Zeno, without access to some of the true dual wield items in the future, would have suffered. But extremely easy to gear up to a ton of attack because of that. Now, one of the other things that is definitely worthy of note with Zeno is that he does have the highest damage potential of any of the characters in the game, but I think, you know, I don't weigh that super strongly, because, you know, if you wanted to do a ratings of, you know, okay, who's the strongest damage dealer in the game, you just plug them in the calculator and then you spit out numbers, and then whoever has the highest number is the best one, but that doesn't tell you the whole story. Zeno definitely wins in terms of damage calculation. He does have the highest damage output potential of any of the damage dealers in the game, because he's ridiculous. To be able to reach such high amounts of attack and still have free slots for killer materias and things like that is just crazy. So he is very good in that regard. So I know this is somewhat contradictory, but one of his cons is that he's not as tanky. I know he said he's somewhat tanky, but he's not as tanky as Esther, and that's basically who we're comparing him against. And then he has a similar drawback to Akstar, which is that he has a long and complex rotation, where if he goes down, it is extremely disruptive, especially since his opening cooldown as part of his rotation lasts for 10 turns, which is a very long time to have to wait to get into your full burst damage. So with all of that described, briefly, there are a couple of conditions where each character wins. Number one, Esther will win if death and re-raise are unavoidable. She gets back on her feet much more quickly than Zeno and Akstar, meaning that if she has to die, which she's not usually going to, but if she does have to die, she's going to manage it a lot better. She also wins if the boss is a machine or a stone enemy, because she's got innate killers for that. And if you and your party and your damage dealers are going to be taking high amounts of fixed AoE damage, Esther's going to win simply because she can weather it effortlessly, compared to maybe Akstar or Zeno, who are going to struggle to tank that much damage without dying. And even if Esther did die, she doesn't care that much. She just jumps right back into her rotation and is set back up in a couple of turns. Zeno and Akstar can be screwed for a long time if they go down. Now, Akstar wins if the enemy favors Ice Element, and this is definitely like a very narrow, very narrow opportunity. You know, like it's not. I have to be honest, there are not that many situations wherein Akstar wins compared to the other two damage dealers, but if your foe is weak to ice damage, Akstar is going to be your best option. Additionally, Akstar wins if you're in trials that feature the kill with maximum style mission. That's basically, you know, my secret mission for every single one, where I'm like, you know what, I want to be using my favorite units, and I want them to look badass while they're doing it. Akstar probably wins in that category. I'm not biased, and that's definitely, you know, not an opinion. He's definitely the coolest. And then the other thing is Akstar has the potential to win if there are lower amounts of fixed AoE damage, but ultimately Akstar, against these other damage dealers, you know, he came at the same time and he was anticipated with them, but I think that his ancillary perks and benefits just struggle to compete against Esther and Zeno when all three of them are able to do more than sufficient damage to take down the boss. So, unfortunately, not as many scenarios where he's going to be better than either of the two others, but me personally, I'm going to be running with Akstar the majority of the time, just because I have looked forward to his sprite for such a long time. I love his character. Yeah, so he's the flavor for me. So even if he's not the best, I will be using him, and there's no reason you can't use him either. Now, if we go down to Zeno, Zeno wins if the enemy doesn't disrupt his rotation, and what I mean by that is if the enemy does not dispel his imperils, if the enemy does not cast death on him, if the enemy does not, if they don't futz around with him, he has some of the best damage in the game. It is very obnoxious to deal with sometimes though, because he does have such a high fire imperil, right? And you want that up for your whole rotation. But if a boss like Azura, for example, this was a frustration that I had to deal with a lot when using Zeno against her, is that she buffs herself like crazy, and you have to dispel her a lot, or you have to remove her buffs a lot, and a lot of times that just removes his fire imperil, and against element neutral enemies, that cuts his damage in half. So it was really frustrating to maximize his rotation against a boss that frequently needed dispelling, or frequently needed, you know, to have the imperils reapplied. So, you know, if that is not the case, then Zeno is going to have a really amazing time. Zeno is also definitely better than the other two anytime where the enemy is weak to fire damage. He is the king of fire damage. Nobody's better than him at fire damage, so if that's what he's bringing to the table and that's what the enemy is weak to, he's the best for it. Now, Zeno is also a winner if you basically have no equipment, if you don't have true double hand gear, if you don't have a lot of nice equipment or a lot of nice bits and bobs and whatnots. Not a big deal, because Zeno comes with so much passive attack in his kit and native dual wield and all this other stuff. He is super new player and mid-tier player friendly, because he does have so much stuffed into his passives in his kit. So he's definitely the best in that situation. Now, time for the verdict. All right, drum roll please. You know, which of the three is the best one? Don't be mad. It's Esther. You know, I have to pick Esther, and the reason for it is because she is so much friendlier to use in more difficult fights. She doesn't have obnoxious stacking damage mechanics, which I think they're fun. Personally, I think, you know, having somebody like Akstar where you use an ability and then it buffs your next ability and it buffs your next ability and you do that until you have your big burst turn, I think that's very, very fun. I enjoy that. But if we're going to talk about the most practical unit to take into battle, Esther is the one, because you just load her up with her limit burst and then knock them down with that LB, because it does do such a crazy amount of damage. And there's a lot of free-to-play friendly equipment that you can use with Esther that the other two don't necessarily have. Thunder has typically been an element that is not too widely resisted, and so, you know, we don't have too much issue with that. And her tankiness, I think, is one of the things that most people are going to be excited about with Esther, because it allows you to make more mistakes in the middle of a trial. And ultimately, that's something that, you know, if you've been to any of my streams, you know, I'm pretty good at this game, but when it comes to playing on live streams, I make a lot of mistakes. Mostly because I'm screwing around. I'm like, let's try these units. Let's try this strategy. I don't know what I'm doing. Let's just, you know, give it a go. And with a unit like Esther, she tends to survive my mistakes. But Akstar or Zeno are going to struggle much more to survive my mistakes. And it makes it so that instead of wiping, you know, my entire party dying if I make a mistake, I'm much more likely to be able to recover. So with that, we come to the conclusion of my video comparing Akstar, Zeno, and Esther together. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. Which one do you think is the best? I want to hear your opinion, and then I will see everybody in the next video.